Preparing for retirement can seem really daunting. There's just so many things to think about. It's a real life stage change, and it feels like the stakes are really, really high. But you do not have to go at it alone. Like there's tons of experts out there, tons of resources, including one called How to Retire. Christine Benz is the author. She's director of personal finance and retirement planning for Morningstar. And she looked for 20 people to share their very, very best lessons on this question. She joins us from Chicago. Hello there.
Hi, Bruce. Great to be here.
You chose 20, only
Yes.
20, not 30, not 50, only 20. How did you determine who to choose?
Well, I do a podcast for Morningstar called The Long View. So I had had contact with a lot of these people who I ended up interviewing for the book. And I just wanted to go deep on a lot of the different tentacles of retirement planning. And I wanted to focus on the financial as well as the non-financial, which as long as I've worked on this, I've focused on the financial, but I realized the non-financial piece is even more important.
You start with a chapter around the importance of visualizing your in retirement lifestyle. And I love that because I often talk about how retirement is not an activity, it is a life stage. No one wakes up and does retirement. That's just not how it works. How do you go about visualizing what that life stage is going to look like?
It's an important exercise. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes people show up in retirement very burned out, and their only visualization for retirement is I need to get off this treadmill.
Yeah.
I need to relax. So you probably have this pent up list of, things that you want to do when you can finally relax. But the point that Michael Finke makes in the book, and he's a professor of financial planning who's done a lot on what makes people happy in retirement, his point is you need to relax from something. And a great reference point is for that is, think about the time when you have struck out on vacation and you had been working really hard at your job and how good it felt and how well deserved that vacation was. And my guess is it was a better vacation than, other vacations perhaps. And I think you want to think about retirement in the same way. You absolutely do want to think about what you will do to relax and have fun, but you'll also want to think about those things that will give you a continuing sense of purpose, a continuing sense of identity. I am X. And so you just don't want to stop with your relaxation list. You want to think about actual activities, things that you want to get done during your retirement life cycle.
Another lesson is to understand how your spending might change. And, so much of the machine around retirement savings is like build the nest egg, build the nest egg, build the nest egg. And then I don't know, that's somehow going to be enough to last me till they throw the dirt in my face at the end of it all. That can look very different depending on the individual, depending on how long they're alive, and depending on their health. What was some insight that you gleaned on that critical question?
Yeah, what we see when we look at the data on how retirees actually spend is that people do spend the most in the early years of retirement, and then spending tends to trend down as people move into, say, their mid 70s, into their 80s. And then some people have uninsured health care costs, in particular long-term care costs that flare up later in life. So assuming that retirement spending will be kind of a straight line, while it might look good in a spreadsheet, it really doesn't dovetail with what we see when we look at the data. And incidentally, people aren't spending less because they're worried about running out necessarily, that we see this pattern across households. Even wealthier households tend to spend less. So if you do want to model that into how you think about your own retirement spending, it argues for being able to give yourself a little bit of permission to spend more in those early years of retirement when you're healthy, when you've got things that you want to do, maybe helping adult children get launched, whatever the case might be. Give yourself permission to spend a little bit more than maybe that standard rule of thumb, that 4% guideline might call for.
And specifically, this is another one, give yourself permission to spend on what matters to you. Ramit Sethi was your guest here. I've been reading his stuff for a million years. What advice did he have on how to actually do this?
Well, his point is, and one thing that comes out in a lot of Ramit's work is that if you're doing this right, you're going to look like a little bit of a weirdo to your neighbors. So his thing is he's not into cars. So even though he could buy a much more expensive car than he drives, he's fine driving that, I don't know, 20-year-old car. His point is take a look inside. Don't just be so focused on doing whatever people are doing in your neighborhood or your friends group or whatever in terms of their spending. Think about what you value and how you want to allocate your spending. It's better than just being on that treadmill where you're just keeping up with everybody else.
Your last chapter is about or includes a conversation with Jordan Grummett, a hospice doctor. And the headline is Leave No Regrets, which, is something we've heard that message many, many times. What do people value most on their deathbed? He has an interesting exercise that you and he talk about called the life review. What does that entail?
Yeah, these life reviews can readily be found online. It's essentially a questionnaire that helps you delve into what are the things that are most important to you? What do you want your legacy to be? And Jordan's point is he's worked with a lot of people who are literally on their deathbeds, but his point is don't wait. That if you are embarking on retirement, this is a really fruitful time in your life to explore possibilities that maybe you'd had to set aside for whatever reason in the past, whatever many working years you've had. So his point is don't wait. And he has this concept of what he calls big P purpose and small P purpose. He says big P purpose are like the really aspirational things that people might want to do during retirement, like writing a novel or climbing a mountain or starting a foundation. But he said that those things give people a lot of purpose anxiety. They're stressed out. They don't not sure what their purpose should be. So his point is start with what he calls some small P purposes, some things that are an easier lift, like, oh, I just want to be the best partner to my spouse that I could possibly be, or a great grandparent, or maybe pursue some hobby that I had to leave aside. His point is that some of those small P purposes are just as impactful. So start down that path
Mm.
of just looking at some of those types of things.
The book is called How to Retire, but I'd like to ask before we go here, when should someone engage in these questions? Because I can imagine for a 25-year-old, like, this is ridiculous. And for an 85-year-old, not a bad thing, but they probably missed some good years in which this insight would have been helpful. For you, what's the ideal, forget age, but what's the ideal life stage? Is it, 2 years before you're completing work? Is it 10? What guidance would you give on that?
10 seems like a good number. And the point is to not show up right before you're ready to retire without having explored some of these things. I like the idea of getting ahead of it. And you may find that work is actually part of your retirement plan, even though that seems oxymoronic. But you might find that you do want to continue some version of your work later for longer. And so the sooner you start that, the sooner you can get your work into a position where you're doing more of the things you really like, and maybe you're setting aside some of the things you don't like as much. So I love the idea of starting this a good 10 years before
Yeah.
you actually intend to retire.
Really interesting stuff. Christine, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Bruce.
Christine Benz is Director of Personal Finance and Retirement Planning for Morningstar. She joined us today to talk about her book, How to Retire. There's 20 lessons in there. All of them are super practical, and they cover the waterfront in terms of some of the very, like hard specific skills, and also some of the softer skills and tougher conversations you need to have with your spouse, your kids, your parents, and probably yourself.